Hello and welcome everyone to the WorkSource Georgia Academy's Local Board Requirements and Best Practices training session. My name is Brittany Singer and I'm the Compliance Director for TCSG's Office of Workforce Development. This training is geared towards local staff who are involved in facilitating local workforce development board operations. And we envision this training can be used for, either new staff taking on board operations, but can also serve as a refresher for those more veteran staffers. This topic is something that we do come back to in our trainings nearly every year, but as local boards are ultimately responsible for leading the work at the local level, we believe that this is a really vital area to ensure effective operations. So we hope to spend this time focusing on real life scenarios gathered from all of you and discussing best practices for addressing them. The slides will have a lot of information regarding requirements for the various topics we'll cover, but I'll also be providing examples to kind of underscore those points. This portion of the training is pre-recorded, but we'll have the opportunity for live questions at the end. Please feel free to enter questions in the chat as we go, and I will get to as many as possible at the end of this session. So before we jump into the main body of today's session, here's just a quick overview of what we'll be discussing today. First, we're going to talk about local board membership, which includes the roles and responsibilities of officers and core partners. And then we'll discuss some membership related questions. Then we'll get into operations and cover notice and posting requirements, as well as conflict of interest, effective bylaws, and then briefly touch on Robert's Rules of Order. We will then get into member engagement and address some best practices for ensuring that your local board is active and effective in both onboarding and maintaining members, as well as focusing on effective communication strategies. Finally, we'll briefly discuss the state oversight piece of this whole puzzle and talk about board certification, as well as OWD's annual monitoring process of board operations. So I wanted to provide you all with the applicable references that you will see throughout this presentation. These are all linked on this slide to make it easier to find, and this presentation or this PowerPoint will be made available to you after the training. So you'll note that this includes both federal and state citations, as well as some of the state training resources. I wanted to point out in particular the resource guide that's linked on here is something that we put out last year. And as new questions come in, this is a living document that we, update, and it can be found on our website. Questions that come up today will likely be added to this resource guide as well. So if you ever have questions, always be checking back. That guide, gets updated periodically. Additionally, there are some other WorkSource Georgia Academy training sessions on here. I'll be referencing these later in the presentation, but because these resources exist, I won't be getting too deep into what's covered there. But I wanted to provide a link here, and I advise you guys to take a look at those at your leisure as well. So I like to start off training sessions sort of discussing why a topic is important. And I mentioned earlier that, under WIOA, the local board is given pretty broad authority and responsibility to direct the work of the local workforce system. So on this slide, you'll see the statutorily defined responsibilities assigned to local boards. And while I'm not going to go through each of these, I did want to talk about them briefly. So you'll see there's three main categories here of responsibilities: strategic functions, system capacity building, and then system alignment and effective operations. So with regard to strategic functions, these are those tasks that, direct the day-to-day work of the local system. This includes things like setting priorities for delivering services and identifying areas of need and opportunity in the local plan, as well as handling the practical matters such as budget development and negotiating performance accountability measures. The second category, system capacity building. These tasks focus more on expanding the reach of the workforce system and requires the board to really be thinking ahead. They should be asking themselves, how do we address the needs, challenges, and opportunities that are on the horizon? you know, we've seen this past year, things can happen quickly that will affect the folks we're able to serve, you know, i.e. the economic effects of the pandemic, but there is a lot that we can plan for if we're engaging employers, identifying career pathways, and really focusing on strategies for using technology to maximize the system. And then the final category of responsibility is system alignment and effective operations. And these roles rely on using and maximizing the potential already built into the system to ensure effective operations. You know, for example, program oversight shouldn't happen just for oversight's sake. From a strategic planning perspective, implementing and evaluating a program can help you identify the necessary changes, you know, to ensure that you do it even better the next time around. So system alignment also relates to aligning those required partners within the workforce system. You know, these folks and institutions are a mandated part of the system, but local boards should always be evaluating how well those required actors are coordinating their respective services and resources. So while a lot of the, you know, requirements for local boards may seem tedious and sometimes it's a bit burdensome, the role the board plays is incredibly important. You know, so we implement these things because it's vital to ensure that there's a smooth, effective, and compliant local board operation. So next up, we have the membership requirements. And this slide has a very simplified list of the membership requirements defined by WIOA. Now, I will say, if you were building a local board from scratch, I highly recommend that you look at the actual language of the law to ensure that your members fit the required criteria. We do have a tool that we use in board certification and in monitoring. So if you're ever building a board from scratch, I'm happy to share that with you to kind of help you make sure that you're crafting it correctly. However, we're just going to hit on the high points today, so this list will suffice for our purposes. You know, the goal of local board membership under WIOA is to ensure that the appropriate actors within the workforce system are represented to help guide the work of the program. You know, to that end, Congress stipulated that a majority, so 51% of the board needs to be business representatives, 20% needs to be workforce representatives, and then the balance needs to include some key education and government members, and then whoever else the CLEO sees fit to appoint. If you only have the absolute required members and the appropriate percentages, the minimum number that a board can be is 19 members. So we'll jump more into this in a minute, but just as a reminder, if you have a smaller board, it becomes really, really important to look carefully at who is representing each category. You know, just because there's not as much wiggle room there if you accidentally miscategorize someone. So, you know, on that note, dual representation is allowed, but it can get pretty tricky when you have a smaller board. So just be keeping that in mind. You'll notice on this slide also, there are numbers next to small business, labor organizations, and then employers with registered apprenticeships. In the commentary on the final rule, USDOL made it clear that those need to be distinct seats on the board. So at least 2 of your business representatives must be from small businesses. And if you're curious, that definition is included in the law. And then the labor representative cannot also be your registered apprenticeship representative. There have to be 2 separate individuals from labor organizations, and then a 3rd individual who represents the apprenticeship programs. There are some workarounds to this, especially if you don't have adequate labor representation in your area. So for example, if that's the case in your LWDA, then a representative from one of the other workforce categories, i.e., you know, community-based organization, youth organization, those could substitute for a labor seat. So basically, if you lack labor reps in your area, then you'd need to compensate by adding more reps from the broader workforce category to still meet that 20%. This composition piece can get a little difficult to talk about when we're just discussing hypotheticals. So again, I recommend that you reach out to the compliance team regarding any specific composition questions you have. You know, I mentioned earlier, we have an Excel tool for monitoring that, again, I'm happy to share with you all if you need it in putting together your board composition or evaluating if you're at the appropriate levels. Next up, we've got some common questions regarding membership requirements. So as I mentioned earlier, dual representation is allowed. It's not expressly prohibited in WIOA. And in the final commentary, or on the commentary on the final rule, USDOL does say that flexibility for board membership is appropriate. But again, this is a topic that's difficult to discuss using hypotheticals. So I'm just going to lay out some basic rules when considering, whether a board member can wear multiple hats. So dual representation does not remove the 19-member minimum. Like I said before, it can get tricky with a smaller board. So that's something I recommend you reach out to us to talk through. And then there are conditions imposed in 20 CFR 679-320H. And an individual wearing multiple hats must fully meet the requirements for each category they represent. It is basically what that citation says. I know that probably seems like it goes without saying, but we've encountered some interesting classifications of members, so I always like to mention that. And then finally, with regard to dual representation, it's mainly meant to account for differences in structure of core programs across the country. Say you have a couple different titles under one agency, you may have one person representing all of those required partners. It kind of just varies by local area and by state how they set it up. But it's not meant to make meeting the composition requirements easier or to reduce the size of local boards, past that 19 minimum. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're entertaining having someone wear multiple hats on your board. The next question we get is regarding Chamber of Commerce employees. So can Chamber of Commerce employees represent a business seat on the local board? And the short answer is yes. Chamber employees are actually allowed to fill either a business seat, sometimes they're classified as a community-based organization, and then sometimes they fill the economic development seat on the board. But specifically, in order to fill a business seat, that individual has to meet the following criteria per the regulations. So one, they need to be an owner, chief executive officer, or other individual with optimum policy making or hiring authority, and they need to be able to provide employment opportunities in in-demand industry sectors or occupations. So to expand a little bit there, optimum policy making authority, that means an individual who can reasonably be expected to speak affirmatively on behalf of the entity that they're representing, and to be able to commit that entity to a chosen course of action. They can't just be saying like, oh, maybe we could do this. They need to be empowered to say, yes, my organization can do X, Y, Z to help, towards this project or this idea. Generally speaking, this means either the president or CEO of the chamber. However, it just depends on what role those chamber staff serve. For example, someone who is a director of business development or a director of member engagement may be an appropriate person to fill that seat on the local board. However, if the person is maybe like the director of communications for the chamber, they might not have the appropriate power within the organization to make those decisions. So that person might not be appropriate. The next question is, can local board members serve also on the state board? And again, yes, the short answer is yes. As long as that individual has the time to be engaged in both boards, then the overlap is certainly encouraged. In the past, we've had a handful of folks on the state board who also served on various local boards. And honestly, they were some of the most well-informed state board members we had, and were able to offer a really good perspective on what's happening at the local area, when we were having various discussions with the board. So that is always encouraged if they have enough time. And then the final question is, what role do core partners play on the local board? And so we've mentioned this, many times in what we do. WIOA places a strong emphasis on planning across the multiple partner programs. To ensure alignment in service delivery and just making sure that the needs of the system as a whole are met. So while local staff usually serve as staff to the board, the board should function to meet the goals of all partners and actively encourage collaboration amongst them. The board should not be led solely by the Title I entity's vision, but rather, what most benefits the workforce system as a whole. Again, there's a reason that all these people are placed on this board and that these are the required stakeholders in our work. They have an important perspective to offer. And so we want the boards to be considering, all aspects of that. So related to membership are the roles of the local board officers. The only two officer positions that are actually stipulated by the law and the state rule are the local board chair and the vice chair. Now, you might, of course, also have standing committee chairs that might make up the membership of your executive committee, but there's no requirement for who those individuals should be. They don't need to be a part of a certain category like the chair and the vice chair do. However, both the chair and the vice chair must be a business representative. And another important point is that election process must be included in your bylaws. Now, even more than these being required positions on the board, these roles are important to the actual flow of meetings and the engagement of other board members. So, we'll recognize that, the appointment of board members obviously is the responsibility of the CLEO, and then the chair and vice chair are elected by the other members of the board. Of course, a lot of this is out of the hands of local staff in terms of actually selecting the individuals to fill this role. However, once they are chosen, there are certainly things you can do to help ensure that they're successful. We'll talk about general onboarding for board members later in the presentation, but I wanted to specifically address how to onboard a local board chair. Because their role is critical to effective board operations, you should really be in regular communication with the chair and be very clear about what the expectations for the role are and the time commitment required. It's important to establish with your board chair both the timing and the method of communication. If something comes up, are they best reached by phone or email? Do you have the right phone number for them, or is it just their office number? How far in advance of meetings do they want to review agendas and action items and all the things that come before the board? A lot of board chairs want to be briefed on items ahead of the meeting so that they can appropriately facilitate questions and discussions on the topic. So, you want to know how your chair would like to approach the role. I think it's important to recognize that none of this is automatic and that board chairs do need a little bit of guidance. So these, are important conversations to be having with them, both once they're selected and kind of throughout their tenure as the chair. Additionally, I think it's important to keep them informed through, I guess, what I'll call continuing education opportunities. For example, are you making sure that the board chair is invited to the annual WorkSource Georgia conferences or training sessions that we offer throughout the year? And or participating potentially in like peer learning opportunities with other chairs around the state. Again, it's just important to establish those expectations, and keeping them informed is important to the success of the board. And I will say we have some excellent chairs across the state who have been doing it for a little while, who are well versed in what it takes, and I think would be open to kind of helping new chairs learn the ropes. So I urge you to reach out to the other local area directors and see about getting your chairs hooked up with each other to kind of do some peer learning. So up next, I've included some brief points regarding Robert's Rules of Order on this slide, but this is one of the topics that we actually have a full PowerPoint on, which I've linked on this slide as well. In the interest of time, I'm not going to cover everything from that PowerPoint, but I am happy to take questions on it at the end. So per state rule, local board meetings, of course, need to be conducted in accordance with Robert's rules. And this means that the chair should be very familiar with parliamentary procedure. I don't believe that many of our local boards see particularly contentious debate, but these rules, help facilitate the transaction of business. They can promote cooperation and harmony by setting the parameters for how to make a motion and moderating discussion, calling a vote, and all of those things that happen during a meeting. And then, of course, it ensures that all members have equal rights and privileges and obligations. not everyone on your local board is, maybe super chatty or extroverted and willing to raise their hand in the middle of a discussion to say something. And so this kind of allows time for having like a set parameter so they know like, okay, this is my chance to say it here. I'm going to submit this to the chair, just kind of helping make sure that everyone gets a say in what's happening. And again, that other PowerPoint is linked on this slide. So next we're going to cover the maybe the highlights, I guess I'd say, regarding federal and state sunshine provisions. The presentation on Robert's Rules of Order that was linked in that previous slide also covers this topic. So I suggest that you take a deeper look at that if you've got any in-depth questions about sunshine provisions. That's all covered there. But the basics are WIOA requires that local boards must conduct business in an open manner and lays out some explicit items that need to be made public, such as your local plans, one-stop operator selection, the list and affiliation of your local board members, board minutes, and board bylaws, among other things. But the federal citations do not actually lay out that timeline for notice and posting of these items. So we're going to move into looking at the state requirements, which cover more detail in that regard. So the Georgia Open Meetings Act lays out more specifics about the sunshine provisions, such as what constitutes a meeting. So I've included the definition here. Of course, it's a gathering of quorum of the members of the governing body of an agency at which any official business, policy, or public matter of the agency is formulated, presented, discussed, or voted upon. And as you see here, this also pertains to any committees of that governing body. So the piece I really want to get into a little more is the notice and posting requirements with regard to local boards. So first up here, we've got notices, and this of course is the announcement of the place and time of the board meeting. And this needs to be posted at least 1 week in advance. And then you'll see the language here. It needs to be contained in a conspicuous place available to the public at the regular place of an agency or committee meeting. So this physical posting of the meeting is of course really dependent on where your board meets. And obviously that can vary across the areas. But what I want to talk about here too is the technology piece of these postings. The citation says that the notice should also be available on the agency's website. And I just wanted to hit on the point that this is increasingly important today. Not only because in 2021 most people are going to be looking for the notice of the meeting online anyways, but obviously this is especially important because a lot of public spaces are still closed due to the pandemic. So people may not be regularly in that space to know that a board meeting is going to happen there. So it's important that that electronic access is all we've got at the moment. And it's really important to make sure that you're making that information available to the public. So with regard to agendas, when posting those agendas, this should be available really as far in advance as possible, or as reasonably possible. But within 2 weeks is the recommended time frame here. I know at least for our work with our state board committees and the board meetings, sometimes things are changing until the week of the board meeting, and so we'll post it within a week of the meeting usually. I also wanted to highlight here, if there are ever changes to the agenda, if you say you failed to include a topic on the meeting agenda, the board is still able to take that up. They're not, really stuck with what's on the agenda if something important comes to light. If it was just an oversight or just something that came up, that's still fair game. However, on the flip side of that, if something is included in the agenda, you cannot just skip it. If the topic needs to be removed, say, the board wants more information before they vote on something or discuss something, or even if it was included by accident, that needs to be formally recognized in the meeting and reflected in the meeting minutes, that, that item was being removed from the agenda and the board was okay with that. Maybe you're going to table it for the next meeting, that's fine, but make sure it's reflected in the minutes. And with regard to minutes, a summary of what was acted on and the meeting attendance needs to be written and made available to the public within 2 business days of the meeting. And just to give you an idea of what this looks like, this can just be an annotated agenda. Typically what we do for the state board is, maybe write up the motions, like the name of who motioned, who seconded, and that it was unanimous, or, if there were any abstentions or no votes, that's included there. So write up the motions and the outcome of the vote. And then, of course, the full minutes don't need to be made available until they are officially approved by the board, which, of course, as you know, usually happens at the next meeting. So that doesn't need to be completed until they are in their final official form. But for those full minutes, at a minimum, they must include the names of the members present at the meeting, a description of each motion or other proposal made, and the identity of the people making and seconding the motions, and a record of all votes, which must include anyone abstaining, recusing, or voting against a proposal. Now, if the action was unanimous, you can just say that. Unless the minutes reflect otherwise, it will be presumed that the action was unanimous. So again, with regard to posting those, we really encourage you to utilize your website and social media accounts to your advantage when meeting these requirements. I know that many local areas have done work on updating your websites recently, and that's really great to see, just making it easier for people to find when the board's meeting and how to get on those meetings. I do always recommend reaching out to the OWD Communications Team. If you run into any stumbling blocks there or have questions or need ideas about how to better utilize those resources, Shamika, Andrea, and Tyler are a fantastic resource for you all, and I'm certain that they can provide you lots of assistance and ideas in that regard. The final point I wanted to make while we're on this topic is I wanted to touch on the record retention requirements for local board materials. Now, there's nothing specific to local board documents regarding records retention. However, I wanted to share what we do for both the State Workforce Board as well as TCSG's board, which is we keep a copy of the minutes archived forever. But then the agenda and any other, like the meeting packets, any other items that we have, we keep those for about 5 years just to be safe. So that I've not seen anything different in the local areas really. And again, there's no hard and fast citation on this, but that's just the general practice that we follow. So up next, we're going to talk about the local board bylaws. So, these are the rules that govern the organization, and it's important to remember that these are legally binding, which is why we hold you to them when we are out monitoring. If your local board is doing something that is outside of what's allowed in your bylaws, that is a finding because these are legally binding rules. So, it's just important to remember that these do really hold a lot of weight, and I always like to recommend to people, make sure you're putting stuff in the bylaws that really serves your board and makes your operations function effectively. You don't want to be tying your own hands by what you put in the bylaws. So at a minimum, these need to address your election process for chair and vice chair. It should include your total number of board members. Which an important point there, again, in terms of not tying your own hands or making things more difficult, we always recommend that you put that it will be a minimum of 19 members. Once you start including like a hard number that you want to have, that kind of gets you in a bit of a pickle if you have any issues with vacancies lasting too long or anything like that. So just be mindful of that what you're putting in there does carry weight and will be something you're measured against in monitoring. Of course, also you need to include term limits. What are the quorum levels, which at a minimum needs to be a majority, so 51%. Your number of annual meetings, which again is another thing that we recommend that you, I always recommend you put the language of 4 times annually. A lot of people are tempted to put in there that they will meet quarterly. However, again, that's an area where you are then taking away flexibility if you have an issue meeting within a given quarter. And then, of course, you need to include the conflict of interest provision among any other thing that your board and your CLIO see fit to include in the bylaws. So some commonly asked questions around board bylaws are listed on this slide. So we'll start off with quorum, which is maybe an easy one, but I always like to hit on it again. What is quorum? Unless your bylaws set a stricter standard, quorum is at minimum a majority, so 51% of the board. You might include a higher percentage when you're electing a board chair, for example. I've seen a lot of areas do a minimum of 75% for quorum for that type of vote. So what happens if we don't meet quorum? Now, there's a couple scenarios I want to propose here. So board meetings can begin without a quorum. So say you've got a couple members that are running late, they're going to be there, but you don't want to wait on them to get started. That's fine. You can go ahead and get started. However, you cannot take up any motions or votes until you meet quorum, except to adjourn the meeting. The other thing about quorum is that once you meet it, you have it for the whole meeting. So say someone needs to jump off the call maybe 10 minutes early, you still have quorum for the entirety of the meeting. Now, if a board does not meet quorum at a given meeting, those action items must be tabled for the next meeting where you do have the appropriate number of folks there. This includes voting on your agenda and your meeting minutes. So if you don't have quorum, you've got to table any kind of action item, policy, agenda, minutes, anything. I will say that we still highly encourage boards to conduct the meeting and discuss action items, even if no official action can take place. You know, a record of that meeting still needs to be maintained if you do that to reflect any discussion. But I think it's a little silly to get everyone together and say, oh, we don't have quorum, we're not actually going to do this. There's still important discussion that can take place even if you can't officially vote until the next meeting. I want to be clear, though, that if you send out an invite for a full board meeting and say your RSVPs indicate that you aren't going to have quorum, do not just cancel the meeting. At that point, your first step should be reaching out to members who either didn't RSVP or who RSVP'd as not attending, you know, and kind of try to figure out what's preventing them from attending and really stressing the importance of meeting quorum and being present for board meetings. This is something that we have to do sometimes for our state board, both for the full board meeting and for our committees. And a lot of times folks will understand and will be able to rearrange things if they know that you're close, but not quite at quorum. If they know that, oh, if I come to this meeting, it'll get us where we need to be. A lot of the times, if they're able, they will, you know, rework things. However, if, you know, a good number of your board are not able to attend and you know that right off the bat, getting all those RSVPs saying, no, I can't come, then at that point, you should consider setting up a new date. And at that point, I would say it is appropriate to cancel the meeting and maybe re-poll your members to find a better date and time to have the meeting. So, you know, these options to get a full board meeting should be exhausted before you move to just having the executive committee meet instead. You know, most local areas, their bylaws are set up to allow them to hold an executive committee meeting to vote on behalf of the full board. But what we want to avoid is just having an executive committee meet all the time. You know, there's flexibility in allowing the executive committee to meet, but that's not what the law intended when setting up local boards. And frankly, in my opinion, it puts too much power in the hands of just a few folks to make decision for the entire area. Again, you know, there's a required composition of local boards for a reason, and those individuals have important perspectives on the workforce needs in your area. So you should really be striving to have as many full board meetings as you can and only use that executive committee option, you know, in emergencies. So how do we determine quorum if there are vacant seats? So again, I will always offer the advice of check your local bylaws first. but a quorum will consist of the majority of the members remaining qualified. So that means that unless you have a special provision of the bylaws that prohibit it, vacant seats can be excluded for matters defining quorum. So for example, if you have 22 members on your board, but there are 2 vacant seats, then you would only need 51% of 20, so 11 people to make up quorum because those 2 seats are empty. So again, just gives you a little more flexibility there if your board's sort of in flux and maybe you're waiting on appointments from your Clio, it may help you there. So moving on to frequency of meetings, how often should the board meet? And I touched on this a little bit already, but at a minimum, state rule requires that boards meet at least 4 times annually. Again, this is something we run into in monitoring fairly often, but many boards are tempted to include a provision in their bylaws that requires them to meet quarterly. So again, I recommend keeping the language at 4 times annually because it gives you more flexibility to move around meetings a little bit. If folks aren't able to meet within a given quarter, you want to make sure that the bylaws work for you and again, don't unnecessarily tie your hands. So the final question we get a lot surrounding this topic is if local boards can't meet via teleconference, why do the bylaws require outlining the use of technology to improve board functions? And one point about this is that prohibition on local boards being able to meet via teleconference. Of course, now we're in a different emergency situation where that's enabled, but that's a state rule, which is decided by the legislature. That's not something that the state office or the state board have the ability to change. And obviously that's a little bit in conflict with WIOA. However, this language here about use of technology to improve board functions is not necessarily talking about technology as it relates to conducting the actual meeting. Instead, this is referring to the local board using technology to maximize the accessibility and effectiveness of the system. So for example, this is speaking more towards facilitating connections and developing strategies for aligning your technology and data system across one-stop partners. So maybe the board encouraging or looking at options to kind of streamline your intake and case management processes at your one-stop. Not necessarily about how your board meetings function. However, there are some ways that this can be applied to conducting board meetings. And some examples of using technology to improve your board functions may include, very standard things of disseminating electronic copies of meeting materials to your members instead of paper. Making sure that you email those materials out or having a Dropbox folder that they can look at versus just providing them the paper packet the day of. This can also include, you can teleconference in your guests and speakers. And even if in normal times your board members can't participate via teleconference, you can still get guests and speakers to call in. Or this could be utilizing videos or, different presentations of, say success stories in your area to kind of highlight what services and projects you're offering and how that's affecting your community. So there are some options there. Now, next we're going to talk about conflicts of interest. So again, per state rule, this is something that's defined by the legislature. A conflict of interest is an instance in which a public official's private or personal interests might prevent or appear to prevent them from exercising, their judgment, discretion, powers, or duties in an unbiased manner. Now, when it comes to local responsibilities, I'm certain you're all well aware of this, but a conflict of interest provision, as we stated earlier, needs to be included in the board bylaws. But then once a member is appointed, they are required to sign and date a copy of the bylaws and the conflict of interest provision. The language on the slide here says which shall be submitted to TCSG OWD. However, you don't need to submit that once they're appointed. That's something we'll collect in our annual monitoring and check at that point. We'll reach out to you when we need it, so you guys don't have to worry about just submitting that every time you get a new appointment. And again, a member is only required to sign at one time. And then the most important piece of this is that new members must sign this prior to participating in any official action. Otherwise, that will be void. So, say they come to their first meeting, you need to get them to sign that conflict of interest before they participate in any votes. Otherwise, their vote will not count. And then if there is a potential conflict of interest, or in fact there is a conflict, the member in question has to recuse themselves, and then that needs to be announced and formally reflected in the minutes. Again, this isn't something that just kind of happens automatically. It needs to be put in the meeting minutes to show, yes, this person recused themselves for, this potential conflict. And to offer some additional context here, my outlook on conflict of interest is that, the provisions are not meant to avoid conflicts altogether, but rather puts in place steps to ensure that nothing inappropriate happens as the result of a conflict or a potential conflict. We live in the real world, issues are going to come up, but as long as you have the appropriate process to follow, then you're okay. For example, on the state board, we have the commissioner of the Georgia Department of Labor, but of course the SWIB also votes on awarding the rapid response contract, which is currently with GDOL. So when that happens, the commissioner of GDOL, he'll recuse himself. He doesn't participate in the discussion. It's noted officially in the minutes, and then the board can vote on it, and that's not a problem, with him being on the board. The conflict or the potential for conflicts is there because the required members of the board, are important stakeholders in the system. There is going to be some potential for conflicts there. Another example is that local boards may have individuals whose companies have benefited from WIOA services in the past. And that by itself does not preclude them from serving on the board. In fact, in my opinion, I think past experience with the program could be very beneficial to the board and the services in your area, because that person or that company can provide a unique perspective as a former recipient of business services, for example. So again, if a conflict arises, the member has to recuse themselves from any interested vote. They refrain from participating in the discourse on the topic. Another important point here is they are not required to leave the room. I know we had some local boards doing that in past years, but that's not required. But again, the recusals need to be announced and formally reflected in the minutes. So next we have local board attendance and vacancies, which again, this is something that is stipulated by the state rule on local boards, is that a board member shall be automatically removed and replaced for failing to attend 3 consecutive meetings without cause. So here you also have listed the acceptable documentation for cause. And again, this is going to be dependent on your bylaws if you have a set process for this, but cause must be shown and documented prior to missing the meeting. It needs to be communicated to the board chair in a timely manner. And so some examples of what we've seen in monitoring, acceptable documentation could include, say, an email prior to the meeting asking to be excused due to a work conflict, an illness, another community board meeting commitment, or something in that vein. You could also have a phone log documenting that the board member asked to be excused prior to the meeting due to one of those reasons. But again, this is something that needs to be formally documented. You can't just say after the fact, oh, no, they told me they're not coming. From a monitoring perspective, that's not going to be an acceptable bit of documentation there. We need to see it dated ahead of time. In terms of best practices, we really encourage the use of an attendance tracker. This doesn't need to be anything fancy, but just an easy to reference spreadsheet of who attended which meetings. I find this easier than going back through your meeting minutes to check the roster or to find your notes from the meeting. If you have this tracker and you can say, oh, so-and-so has missed 2 meetings already, maybe it's time to kind of offer a reminder to that board member of saying, hey, you've missed 2 meetings. We'd really love to see you at the next one. Does this date work for you? Kind of figuring out, are they going to be able to make it? And if not, making sure they understand what they need to submit to show cause for missing the meeting, because otherwise they will be removed from the board. Another best practice we've seen regarding attendance is that when you send out the meeting minutes, or sorry, the meeting invite, it's really helpful to include a reminder about how to notify the chair if the member needs to miss the meeting, and what constitutes cause. So kind of including those, requirements ahead of time so that they know, oh, it's important for me to be at this meeting. And if I can't go, here's what I need to do, so that you don't find yourself in a pickle later on saying, oh, this person's missed 3 meetings. Now we've got to remove them from the board. I will say half of the issues that we run into with attendance of board members are because those members forget, or were never informed of how and when to communicate their need to miss a meeting. So we definitely recommend an attendance tracker and reiterating those requirements when you send out the invites. So when necessary, if a board member needs to be removed for missing those meetings, it is possible for them to be reappointed by the CLIO. Again, maybe it was a misunderstanding, maybe, they had something going on in their life that made them miss those meetings, but that's since resolved and they are committed to being an active member of the board. That's for your CLIO to decide if they should be reappointed. We also see this when it's a core partner that's maybe missed a couple meetings and been removed. Obviously, that's a little harder, and there are only a certain number of folks at that partner agency that can serve in that role. So they can definitely be reappointed after being removed, but that is a decision for your CLIO to make. Next, we're going to talk about local board vacancies. And as I'm sure most of you are aware, we changed the policy on this recently. It used to be a 60-day time frame, but local boards, the vacancies must be filled within 90 days. If you find yourself approaching those 90 days, a waiver needs to be requested from the state to ensure that your board will stay compliant. We're actually going to cover that in the next slide. So we actually made some changes to this process. It used to run through the programs team, but now it runs through the compliance team. But I realized recently that not everyone is aware that a waiver process even exists. And especially now that we've extended the timeline to 90 days, I just wanted to take the opportunity to cover this. So, if you are approaching 90 days and your CLIO is either having a hard time finding someone willing to serve, or something else is going on that makes it hard to get that appointment scheduled within 90 days, you will need to request in writing to the compliance team a waiver. And that waiver request needs to include the date that seat went vacant, so we know when the 90 days is up. Provide a short explanation of why the vacancy hasn't been filled. Sometimes it's just a matter of getting people's schedules to work out, that the CLIO hasn't had a chance to talk with the local, board chair or anyone and figure out who would be interested in serving. Sometimes there are other issues that prohibit this, but just a brief explanation of what's been happening, and then propose a timeline for when you think that new appointment will be made. Most of the time it's people just need 30 days or 45 days or something, and we will usually grant that request based on what your proposed timeline is. If you don't have one, we'll usually start with a 30-day extension, and then we'll kind of revisit as needed after that. Now, the important thing to remember here is that if your local board bylaws stipulate a shorter vacancy timeline than 90 days, the waiver request must be submitted according to that shorter timeline. We ran into this recently with a local area that still had 60 days as their timeline. And so they needed to submit a waiver at 60 days, not 90 days. And just to reiterate the importance of this, any local board actions taken outside of that vacancy timeline are going to make all of your board actions void. So it's really important to request this waiver. This is something that the federal regs stipulate, and so as long as you have requested it and received an approved waiver from us, your board operations will be good to go. So up next, we'll talk briefly about local board committees. So standing committees are optional under WIOA, but we really recommend using these to assist your local board in carrying out its responsibilities. And I've included the 3 most common committees that we see, which are one-stop, youth, and then an executive committee. And these really kind of help you dig deep into these, subjects that obviously your one-stop. There's a lot going on there. There's a lot of details that need to be hashed out. This may be something you want a committee to take up and dig in even further about, how are we making sure we have, an effective one-stop, that people are getting the services that they need, that our partners are communicating appropriately. With a youth committee, obviously, a lot of areas around the state see issues with recruiting and retaining out of school youth. So maybe that's a topic you want to task your youth committee with, to dig in a little further and kind of figure out some strategies for, working on that challenge. Now, if a local board does have standing committees, they have to be included in your bylaws, and they need to be chaired by a member of your local board. Again, there's no requirement of what category of member needs to chair it. It's more important that the person is enthusiastic about the role and willing to take this on, and can lead the discussion in your committee. And then finally, standing committees are also required by law to appoint members that are not board members. So those folks are not able to vote, but they do need to sign a conflict of interest provision. And the reasoning for this is, for those of you who have been around the system for a little while, under WIOA, youth councils were required, but that requirement was taken out when we switched over to WIOA. But USDOL still encourages the use of standing committees to really, expand opportunities to those additional community stakeholders, because even if they're not, required any longer to sit on the board, they still have a stake in the success of board decisions and can offer an important perspective for serving, whatever category or challenge you're trying to, address in your committee. So we're going to move on to member engagement, talk about some best practices for orientation and onboarding. And this is another area that we do actually have some existing presentations on this. It's linked in that resources and references slide. I believe it's called how to run a board meeting, or it's the train the trainer, train the trainer. We were lucky enough to have, I believe it was ARC and Fulton, kind of presented to us what their onboarding process is like. And those are both really great templates to follow. So I recommend that you check out those presentations if you're looking at, either bolstering your existing onboarding process or starting from scratch. They are great resources to look at. But again, each board member should undergo some kind of orientation and onboarding to understand their role in the system. And, an orientation should at least cover the topics that we've got listed here. So, talk about the broad goals of WIOA. What is it meant to do? What does the workforce ecosystem look like, and required partners? What's the status of that in your local area? Who's at the table? What do they have to offer? Kind of explaining the scope of the system. Obviously, it's important to kind of dive into at least the basics of WIOA funding, talking about the different pots of money, who they can serve with that, what types of programs and services are allowable, and discussing what you've already got up and running in the area. And then, of course, it's important to touch on performance accountability, kind of explaining to new members of, here's what we're tasked with, and then here's what, the metrics that they're holding us to make sure that those things jive and that you're actually meeting those requirements. And then, of course, after an onboarding, you should be actively providing the local board with the information they need to be successful. So we recommend at least annual presentations, if not more often. You should be including things like your budget and finances. Obviously, the board needs to approve the budget annually, but then, maybe you have a check-in in November, say, hey, here's where we're at with this. We're overspending in this category, or we're underspending here. Talk about what you're seeing. Did that line up with your plan for the year? What things may need to be tweaked? Of course, that also, will touch on your enrollment numbers. Are you serving the folks you thought you would serve? What, if not, maybe we need to brainstorm what happened here. How do we need to pivot our services to make sure we are meeting the needs? And then, of course, regular check-ins about your performance measures. I think it's important to do more than just saying, yes, we met it for last year, or no, we didn't, but having those regular check-ins to say, hey, here's where we're at in terms of our progress. Again, we may need to pivot, change up our program design, kind of address whatever deficiencies we're seeing. In terms of best practices, keeping members engaged, I think in my experience with working with the state board and the committees, has a lot to do with how you communicate with them. We have found it very helpful to have one point of contact. Maybe you have a backup as well, but having one person communicate with the board, makes it easier to ensure that you're not bombarding them with information too often. If they need to look through their email and say, hey, so-and-so sent this thing, I'm going to search their name, they can easily find it. Knowing who to contact at your office if they have questions or they can't attend a meeting, anything like that. It's important to just have folks know who they need to talk to. It's also important to, stick to a schedule, and this relates to the third point too, of allowing plenty of time to review documentation. Ahead of a board meeting, I think it's important to let them know we're going to give you 2 weeks to review this, or you'll have a week to review it. Letting them know the expectation. So, maybe they know they have a board meeting on Thursday, but that way the week before the board meeting, they can carve out the appropriate time to review whatever you're sending them. But having those schedule expectations is helpful. We've also found that it's important, there's a lot of business and administrative things to take care of under WIOA, but there's a lot of good being done in your communities, and board members want to see those fun and engaging presentations to show how that work is actually impacting the community. I think they'll see the value of being on the board if they know, hey, this is making a difference in someone's life. People are benefiting from this, and it's more than just reviewing budgets and performance measures. There are people tied to those numbers, and kind of, understanding the bigger picture and the why they're doing what they're doing. And then in line with that, I think it's important to equip your board members with talking points, because if they're going to other community engagements, it's important that they can talk up the work that you're doing. I think if we've said it once, we've said it a million times. One of the biggest downsides of WIOA is that, people just don't know it exists all the time. So I think your board members can be important, messengers out in your community saying, hey, WorkSource so-and-so is doing great work here. And maybe even finding other opportunities to partner with other organizations, or finding more, opportunities to provide participants. That can be a big part of this, of making sure members are talking about it. So the final topic we're going to get in today, and then we'll take questions, is the state oversight piece of this. So as you all may be aware, we come out every 2 years. Well, not come out, we do it as a desk review, but we reach out every 2 years for local board certification. So this is sort of a snapshot of your local board to make sure that it's in compliance with the federal regulations, state policy, and then any governing, bylaws that you have. So, when we do this, we'll look at your up-to-date board listings, we'll look at your bylaws, your current list of one-stop partners to make sure that they are appropriately included. We'll check out your meeting minutes, and then any other, documents as needed. And this operates similar to the corrective action part of monitoring. We'll issue a notice of certification, or if there are issues, we will detail those deficiencies and kind of ask you to set up a plan of how you're going to fix that. But again, board composition is more of a snapshot. We're saying, hey, do you meet the required percentages? Do you have the appropriate seats? And then are the people that are currently in it now, truly filling those categories? And this is different from our annual monitoring, because our annual monitoring is looking more at how are your operations being implemented? Are you following your bylaws for things like vacancies and attendance requirements? Do the minutes get posted appropriately? Do they contain the appropriate information? Are your standing committees operating the way that they're supposed to? So while the tool that we use is the same for both board certification and annual monitoring, and again, that's the tool I've referenced earlier, that we're happy to share that with you if you have any questions about whether your board's compliant or not. They're similar, but they are a little different in that annual monitoring is more of a, are you following what you're supposed to be following? And with that, that concludes our presentation today. Thank you guys so much for sitting through this. Again, I will point you to the references and resources slide of this presentation. please feel free to look at any of the other training resources we have, and we will open it up for questions.